Hi, I'm Jen. If you're looking for a job right now, you're more than likely going to have at least one of your interviews over video. These can come in a variety of forms: a one-on-one live interview, a panel interview, a group video interview, even a pre-recorded video interview. Let's look at 10 Zoom video interview tips which will help you excel in any video interview. I'm talking about Zoom because that seems to be the most popular platform right now, but these 10 tips will help you regardless of what platform that your video interview occurs on: Zoom, Skype, or some other platform entirely. Let's talk about a few general video interview tips, and then I'll jump into some very specific tips that are dependent upon the exact type or style of video interview that you're having. Here's my first tip. Look at the camera, not at the person. This is one of the hardest tips for people to adapt to if you're not used to being on video calls or filming yourself for some other reason. Looking at the camera makes the other person feel like you're looking at them. One way to help this is to position the video of the person that you're interacting with directly beneath the webcam that you are looking at. This way, even if you're glancing back and forth or looking mainly at the person and not your camera, your eye line is not too far off. It's pretty close to looking directly into the camera. Here's what it looks like when I'm looking directly at the camera. And here's what it looks like if I'm looking about where the middle of my screen would be on my laptop. See the difference? It feels a lot more like I'm talking to you when I'm looking at the camera like this versus when it just appears I'm not paying as much attention. Even though people in the interview are going to realize what's happening, it still feels a little more personal when I look at the camera directly like this. The second tip is to place your camera at eye level. Again, this is all about how do you appear. It's a professional polish. With some of these tips, this one and the last one, you notice when someone's not doing it, but you don't notice as much when someone is doing it. So again, let's look at an example of my camera at eye level and my camera where my webcam naturally falls. Now, for me, this is even more exaggerated because I have a smaller laptop, so my webcam is actually at the fold of the laptop. So it's almost at desk or table level, but you can see how dramatically different things appear depending on what height they're viewed from. And it definitely feels a bit more professional, a bit cleaner of a feel when it's more at eye level. The third tip for Zoom video interviews or Skype video interviews is to skip the fun background. I get it. We've all been using video calls probably a lot more than what we have in the past with the ongoing situations around us. However, when you're in an interview, a fun beach scene or city scene or whatever the case may be usually ends up being distracting. And the green screen effects, the integration usually glitches some, so it doesn't look nearly as nice as you think. It's much better to just pick a relatively neutral background. Ideally, you pick something pretty plain behind you, but anything that is relatively straightened up, clean, not showing anything that would be of concern in the video is fine. You can see I have things set up a little special here because I'm filming a video, but let's say I was sitting in my living room and I had a lamp here, either a table lamp or a floor lamp, and I was sitting in the corner of the room. That would work just fine for a video interview. The fourth tip for video interviews is test your setup. You can easily do this if you're using Zoom by going into your settings outside of any call. This way you can check that your camera's lined up, that your speakers or your headset's working just fine, so someone else should be able to hear you and you should be able to hear them. It's great to test these not right before you start the call, but check a little bit ahead of time and then adjust if needed. Do you need more light? If it's a gloomy, overcast day, maybe you need a little more light. Or if you're in a dark room, maybe you need a little more light to help the other person see you better. Again, it's not necessarily that somebody notices a lot of this when everything looks right, but it tends to more often be noticed when it looks wrong. If you're harder to see, if it's harder to look and make eye contact, which makes people feel connected. And that's something that can really be lacking in video interviews versus live interactions when you're working in person, interviewing in person with someone. Those 4 tips apply to any style of interview. Now let's get into some tips that are are a little more specific for different types of video interviews that you may encounter. We're used to the one-on-one interview, and that's pretty common whether it's in person or a video interview. However, there's other styles of interviews that are common, and because a lot of video interviews are replacing in-person interviews, they present their own set of challenges. The first type of interview that's a little bit different is the panel video interview. The panel interview involves multiple different people interviewing you, the candidate for the position. This style tends to be a little more rapid fire than a one-on-one interview because while one person is asking you a question, other people can be thinking about follow-up or separate questions that they want to ask you. The advantage of the video panel interview over an in-person panel interview is when you're in person, you need to be aware of switching up eye contact with different people, engaging everyone, but also being very interactive with the person that's actually asking the question and that you're answering. The nice thing with video is since you look at the webcam and not at each individual, if you're making eye contact with your camera, you are essentially making the feeling of eye contact with every single person that's part of that panel interview. So this is great. That takes a little bit of the work off your plate. But there's other things that are tricky about panel interviews. So here's my first tip for the panel interview. Know your interviewers. Use this tip whether you're doing an in-person or a video panel interview. Know who's interviewing you. What roles do they have? How does that interact with the position that you're interviewing for? How does that maybe change the types of information or content that this person asking questions is hoping to get out of you? And then when you're thinking about your answers, when you're responding to these, try to put it in terms that that person will maybe care a little bit more about. This is about engaging those different people. This also lets you engage the group as a whole. So if you have someone from engineering asking you a question and you have someone from purchasing that's there as well, you could start out responding with an answer that's very applicable to engineering, but you could also talk a little bit about a piece that draws in the person from purchasing. You can engage the whole group in this way in the responses to the panel interview questions. The next tip I have is control the pace of the meeting. It's easy for panel interviews to go very rapidly because, like I said, if you're being interviewed by 3 or 4 people even, and they're all having a chance to think about what they want to ask and follow-up questions as you're thinking, then it can just happen very, very quickly. You don't have time to slow down, take a breath, think about your answers. So an easy way to help set some of the pace is don't feel like you have to rush into an answer. It's okay to pause for a few seconds before you respond. Don't pause every single time. This shouldn't seem like you have to take 10 seconds before you speak after someone else speaks. But if you need 2 or 3 seconds, 4 or 5 seconds occasionally, do that. And also don't feel like you have to elaborate for everyone that's interviewing you on every single question. It can be good to engage people by drawing them in on different questions throughout the interview when you're giving answers. But if you feel the need to do this every single time, then you, one, take up a lot of the interview time, but you also eliminate a lot of follow-up questions. You eliminate a lot of the engagement. So try to give a fairly concise answer, but enough detail that someone could ask you follow-up questions, or they could have pieces to pick up on to follow up with you later on with another question during the interview. Another type of video interview that you might encounter is the group video interview. This group video interview involves multiple different candidates all being interviewed at the same time. That can be by one person at the hiring company or sometimes by multiple people. I think more often than not, we see multiple people on the hiring end because that makes it a little easier working with a lot of different candidates. I think that this and the pre-recorded interview are the 2 toughest types of video interviews. These interviews can be tough enough in person, but being on video adds even more complication. One issue that can hurt a lot of people is if you have a lag in your internet, so beware the lag. If you have slow internet, now is a time to find a different place to interview from. Whether that means it makes more sense to do it on your phone over the cell network rather than doing it over Wi-Fi, or if you need to go to a coffee shop or sit outside a coffee shop or a library or some place that has a faster internet speed than what you do, that is going to really help you. It gets really awkward when you're in an interview and you need to speak up more and this lag comes into play and you're constantly cutting people off or starting to speak over people just because you're 1 or 2 seconds behind. It doesn't take much for this to get really awkward really fast. During group interviews, you should also listen carefully and speak confidently. One of the biggest mistakes people make in group interviews is being so focused on making sure that they get more talking time that they don't really listen to what's being asked. Focus on what's being asked and answering that question rather than just thinking about everything that you want to say during the interview process. As you listen, you'll still need to think quickly, but make sure that you're not ignoring what that question is. And then when you have your answer, speak confidently. You have the least amount of speaking time in a group interview than any other type of interview. So when you do have that chance to be vocal, to talk about yourself, your skills, how you would help the business, take it. Be confident in your abilities. The fourth type of video interview that you might encounter is the recorded or pre-recorded video interview. With this style of interview, you're usually given a website to log into in advance and given a certain amount of time to complete the interview. When you log in, you'll be given usually one question at a time and then given a fixed amount of time to record a video response to it. Sometimes these questions are done by video so you can see the hiring manager or recruiter asking you them, but most of the time they're just typed out and uploaded to the system and then you're fed them one at a time. Typically you would get a question, then you would have a minute or two to think about your response, and then a limited amount of time to record a response. It's fairly normal that it would be 2 or 3 minute limit per question. You should be told at the beginning of the interview how long you'll have. And use that time that you're given to think about your answer before hitting the record button. It's always a bit awkward when someone doesn't take that time. They read the question and they immediately hit record, and then you see them just sitting there for 15 or 30 seconds thinking about it before they give their response. Use the time that you're given. You'll want to answer questions concisely. You do have 2 or 3 minutes typically, but that can go quickly. And even if you have a full 3 minutes, you don't want to ramble. Focus on providing information that is useful, that maybe makes the person interviewing you or the company that's interested in you want to know more about you. These pre-recorded video interviews are typically the first or a very early phase of the interview process. This isn't going to be a final interview or a decision-making interview on who to hire. This is really getting to know you a little more, seeing how comfortable you are sometimes with technology, how you interact, how you talk about your skills. So use this time to get someone more intrigued about you, but don't feel like you have to go on and use that entire time. With that in mind, you'll also want to watch the timer. There may be questions where it's perfectly appropriate to use the full amount of time, but don't wait until the last 15 or 20 seconds of the answer to fit in the key pieces. Keep an eye on the timer and make sure you're not running too low as you're answering. If you do find yourself running low, keep calm and wrap up your response. It's normal to see people panicked that you can tell they've realized how much time they have, and then they're trying to rush and talk twice as fast to get to the end of it. And that comes across pretty clearly in the video. So keep calm, keep your composure, but also be aware of that time limit. These 10 Zoom video interview tips will help you have a much better interview next time, regardless of the format of your video interview. Thanks so much for watching.